Nurse Arya distributed forbidden sweets to quarantined children during her illegal late shifts, as the Vampire King memorized her schedule from the parking garage. The kids treasured her secret visits more than any medicine. Everyone thought she was just another rule-breaking caregiver, but she'd been unknowingly protecting his dying daughter, and he'd tear apart anyone who tried to separate them now. Arya Chen slipped through the quarantine ward's double doors at 11:47 p.m., her sneakers silent against polished linoleum as she navigated corridors bathed in harsh fluorescent light that made everything look sickly and pale. Her jacket pockets bulged with contraband that would cost her job if discovered: homemade chocolate chip cookies wrapped in napkins, tiny origami cranes folded from colorful paper, and hand-drawn pictures of rainbows and puppies that she'd sketched during her lunch breaks. The security cameras swept their mechanical gaze across empty hallways in predictable patterns she'd memorized over 18 months of unauthorized visits, each blind spot mapped in her mind like a treasure hunter's secret route through dangerous territory. Room 237 stood at the end of the East Wing, isolated from the other patients due to an unknown pathogen that had baffled every specialist who'd examined the strange child within. Arya paused outside the door, listening for the telltale sounds of medical equipment and finding only unnatural silence that made her skin crawl. She pushed the door open with practiced caution, peering into darkness broken only by the soft glow of monitoring devices that cast eerie shadows across medical equipment. Luna sat upright in her hospital bed, her impossibly pale skin seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it, hollow eyes fixed on the window with an intensity that made Arya's breath catch in her throat. The child's medical chart clipped to the foot of her bed read like a collection of medical mysteries: severe anemia resistant to all treatments, unknown pathogen showing no response to antibiotics, vital signs that fluctuated in impossible ways that defied human physiology. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Arya had noticed things the doctors seemed to miss or ignore: how Luna never blinked when startled by sudden noises, how her skin felt cold as marble, even when the room was warm, how she would only accept foods that were red in color and would push away anything else with surprising strength for such a frail-looking child. Tonight felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that made the hair on Arya's arms stand up as she approached the bed with a gentle smile. Luna turned her head slowly, those dark eyes fixing on Arya with predatory focus that belonged in the face of a wild animal rather than a sick little girl. For the first time in all their encounters, Luna's lips parted, and she spoke in a voice like autumn leaves rustling in dead wind. "He's watching you." The words sent ice through Arya's veins as she spun toward the window, catching a glimpse of a tall figure standing in the parking lot below, perfectly still among the scattered cars and harsh sodium lights. When she blinked and looked again, the figure had vanished as if dissolving into shadow itself, leaving only empty asphalt and the uncomfortable feeling that something ancient and dangerous had been studying her with inhuman patience. Luna's small hand touched Arya's wrist, with fingers cold as winter metal, and the child smiled for the first time, revealing teeth that seemed just a little too sharp in the dim light of medical monitors that continued their steady electronic heartbeat in the sudden silence. 40 stories below in the underground parking garage, Vampire King Dorian Blackthorn stood motionless in the shadows between concrete pillars, his supernatural senses tracking every movement in the hospital above, as he had for 43 consecutive nights. His daughter Serafina lay dying in room 237, trapped in the body of a human child by a curse so complex and vicious that it represented the pinnacle of vampire magical warfare, a masterpiece of cruelty designed by the Shadowmere clan to destroy him through the slow death of everything he held dear. 3 years ago, they had ambushed his child during a diplomatic mission to the European courts, infecting her with a blood curse that bound her essence to a slowly decaying human form, forcing her to feed on innocent life force to survive, while simultaneously making that very act poison her immortal soul. The curse could only be broken by someone who chose to love her without knowing what she truly was, a condition so specific and unlikely that his enemies had considered it a death sentence wrapped in false hope. He had searched across continents for someone with the pure heart necessary to break such dark magic, watching potential candidates reveal their greed or self-interest or simple inability to love unconditionally when faced with a strange and difficult child. But this nurse, this mortal woman who risked her career night after night to bring comfort to dying children, she possessed something he had begun to believe no longer existed in the modern world, a love so genuine and selfless that it burned like sunlight in his supernatural perception. Arya Chen cared for his daughter, not because she hoped to gain anything, not because she felt obligated by duty or guilt, but simply because a sick child needed comfort, and she had comfort to give. Through enhanced hearing that could detect heartbeats from 3 floors away, he had listened to her read stories in that soft voice, had felt the genuine warmth in her touch when she tucked blankets around small shoulders, had witnessed moments of pure human kindness that reminded him why he had once believed his kind could coexist peacefully with mortals. But time was running out like sand through an hourglass that mocked his centuries of accumulated power and influence. The Covenant of Shadows, the governing council that ruled vampire society from hidden chambers beneath ancient European castles, had issued their final decree 6 weeks ago, delivered by enforcer Alaric Voss, with the cold ceremony that attended all vampire death sentences. His daughter must be destroyed before the next blood moon, her corrupted essence cleansed from existence to prevent the curse from spreading to other vampire bloodlines. A precaution that would also eliminate the only family Dorian had left in a world that had already taken his beloved wife to political assassination centuries earlier. He possessed wealth beyond human comprehension, commanded loyalty from supernatural beings across 6 continents, could bend reality itself through ancient magic, passed down through royal bloodlines. Yet none of it mattered when faced with a curse designed specifically to nullify his advantages and force him to watch helplessly as his child faded away. Tonight, watching Arya move through that sterile room with such gentle care, he felt something he had not experienced in 3 years of desperate searching, something that felt dangerously like hope mixed with the terrible knowledge that hope itself might be the cruelest curse of all. The hospital's security cameras would show nothing when reviewed tomorrow morning, his presence edited from their electronic memories with the same supernatural influence that had allowed him to move unseen through a world of humans who remained blissfully unaware that monsters walked among them wearing familiar faces. But Arya had seen him tonight, just for an instant, when Seraphina had warned her with words that carried the weight of prophecy and doom. The game was changing now, shifting into its final phase where every move would determine whether love could triumph over the darkest magic his enemies possessed, or whether he would lose everything that gave his immortal existence meaning and purpose. Dr. Marcus Holloway sat in his cramped office at 2:30 a.m., reviewing security footage on his computer screen with the methodical patience of a man who had spent 15 years catching hospital staff in violations that could cost lives or careers. The updated camera system had been installed 3 weeks ago after a series of medication thefts, and tonight it had captured something that made his coffee taste bitter in his mouth as he watched Nurse Arya Chen slip through corridors like a ghost carrying contraband to patients who were supposed to be in strict isolation. The footage showed her entering room 237 at 11:47 p.m., spending 43 minutes with the mysterious child known only as Luna, and leaving behind what appeared to be food items that violated at least 6 different hospital protocols designed to prevent contamination in the quarantine ward. He rewound the video 3 times, watching her careful movements and noting the practiced way she avoided camera angles, realizing this had been going on far longer than the 3 weeks since the new surveillance system went online. His fingers drummed against the desk as he considered his options, each one carrying consequences that could ripple through the hospital hierarchy like stones dropped in still water. At 6:15 a.m., he intercepted Arya as she finished her official rounds, her face drawn with exhaustion that went deeper than a simple night shift could explain. Marcus gestured toward his office with the grim expression of a man about to deliver news that would change everything, and Arya followed with the resignation of someone who had been expecting this confrontation for months. The security footage played on his monitor like evidence in a trial, showing her unauthorized visits in stark black and white that left no room for misinterpretation or excuse. Hospital policy is clear about quarantine protocols, he said, his voice carrying the weight of regulations written in blood and learned through decades of medical disasters. You've been entering isolation rooms without authorization, bringing outside food to patients with unknown pathogens, and violating safety procedures that exist to protect both patients and staff from potentially lethal contamination. Arya stood before his desk like a defendant awaiting sentence. Dr. Marcus Holloway sat in his cramped office at 2:30 a.m., reviewing security footage on his computer screen with the methodical patience of a man who had spent 15 years catching hospital staff in violations that could cost lives or careers. The updated camera system had been installed 3 weeks ago after a series of medication thefts, and tonight it had captured something that made his coffee taste bitter in his mouth as he watched Nurse Arya Chen slip through corridors like a ghost carrying contraband to patients who were supposed to be in strict isolation. The footage showed her entering room 237 at 11:47 p.m., spending 43 minutes with the mysterious child known only as Luna, and leaving behind what appeared to be food items that violated at least 6 different hospital protocols designed to prevent contamination in the quarantine ward. He rewound the video 3 times, watching her careful movements and noting the practiced way she avoided camera angles, realizing this had been going on far longer than the 3 weeks since the new surveillance system went online. His fingers drummed against the desk as he considered his options, each one carrying consequences that could ripple through the hospital hierarchy like stones dropped in still water. At 6:15 a.m., he intercepted Arya as she finished her official rounds, her face drawn with exhaustion that went deeper than a simple night shift could explain. Marcus gestured toward his office with the grim expression of a man about to deliver news that would change everything, and Arya followed with the resignation of someone who had been expecting this confrontation for months. The security footage played on his monitor like evidence in a trial, showing her unauthorized visits in stark black and white that left no room for misinterpretation or excuse. Hospital policy is clear about quarantine protocols, he said, his voice carrying the weight of regulations written in blood and learned through decades of medical disasters. You've been entering isolation rooms without authorization, bringing outside food to patients with unknown pathogens, and violating safety procedures that exist to protect both patients and staff from potentially lethal contamination. Arya stood before his desk like a defendant awaiting sentence, her hands clasped behind her back and her chin raised with defiance that surprised him with its quiet intensity. "She's just a little girl who's been alone in that room for 3 months," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "No visitors, no family, no one who cares whether she lives or dies, except the medical staff who treat her like a specimen instead of a human being." Marcus felt the familiar weight of administrative responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket, knowing that compassion and hospital policy rarely aligned in ways that made his job easier. The violations could cost her nursing license, could result in lawsuits if contamination spread, could destroy the career she had built through years of dedication and sacrifice. But Arya's next words carried a steel he had never heard from her before, a determination that seemed to burn in her dark eyes like fire behind glass. "I won't stop visiting her," she said, the simple statement carrying more weight than any elaborate justification. "You can fire me, you can report me to the state board, you can do whatever you think you need to do, But that child will not spend her remaining days alone and forgotten in a sterile room where no one touches her except to draw blood or check vital signs. Meanwhile, 60 miles outside the city, Dorian Blackthorne received word through supernatural channels that made his ancient blood turn cold with a fear he had not felt since the night his daughter was cursed. Enforcer Alaric Voss had arrived at the regional airport on a private jet, registered to a shell corporation that served as a front for Covenant operations, carrying luggage that customs officials would never inspect, and weapons that no human authority could comprehend or control. Vampire King informants, who served as his eyes and ears throughout the region, reported that Alaric had checked into the Meridian Hotel under diplomatic immunity that somehow extended to creatures who officially did not exist, and that he carried with him the Crimson Blade, a weapon forged in the medieval courts of vampire nobility specifically to destroy cursed members of their own kind. The blade had been blessed by vampire priests with rituals so dark and ancient that their very names had been forgotten by all but the most learned scholars of supernatural lore, its edge capable of severing not just flesh and bone, but the very essence that bound a vampire's soul to immortal existence. Supernatural law was absolute in its cruel simplicity. Vampires infected with blood curses that could not be healed within 90 days must be eliminated to prevent contamination from spreading throughout immortal society, a rule written in the ashes of entire vampire bloodlines that had been consumed by magical plagues in centuries past. Dorian calculated the timeline with growing desperation, realizing that his daughter had been cursed 87 days ago, leaving him only 3 days to accomplish what had seemed impossible for nearly 3 months. That same night, Luna's condition deteriorated with frightening speed, her already pale skin taking on a translucent quality that made the veins beneath visible like dark rivers flowing under ice. Her temperature spiked to levels that should have killed a human child, yet she remained conscious and aware, her dark eyes burning with fever and something else that the medical staff could not identify or explain. Dr. Holloway made the decision to transfer her to intensive isolation, a sterile environment designed to contain the most dangerous pathogens known to medical science, effectively cutting off all unauthorized access and sealing her away from the world like a dangerous secret. But Arya Chen had spent 18 months learning the hidden pathways through St. Mercy Children's Hospital, memorizing shift changes and security rotations, and the thousand small details that separated those who belonged from those who did not. She broke her first rule by accessing the intensive care unit with stolen keycard credentials borrowed from a janitor who trusted her enough not to ask questions. She violated her second policy by disabling the alarm on Luna's isolation chamber, using knowledge gained from years of working with similar equipment to bypass safety systems designed to prevent exactly what she was attempting. Her third transgression came when she entered the sealed room without protective equipment, exposing herself to whatever unknown pathogen had baffled every specialist who had examined the mysterious child. Luna lay on the hospital bed like a broken doll, her small body dwarfed by medical equipment that monitored vital signs displaying readings no human child should survive. But when Arya touched her forehead with gentle fingers, Luna's eyes opened and fixed on her face with desperate recognition that went beyond simple gratitude. The child's lips moved in whispered words that Arya could barely hear above the electronic symphony of medical machines, fragments of meaning that would haunt her dreams for weeks to come. "He's coming for me," Luna said, her voice carrying accents that belonged to no modern language, inflections that sounded like they had been shaped by centuries of use in places where sunlight never reached. Luna's fever climbed to impossible heights that registered 107.3 degrees Fahrenheit on digital thermometers, while her pulse remained steady and strong in defiance of every medical principle Arya had learned in nursing school. The child thrashed in her hospital bed, speaking in rapid bursts of what sounded like archaic Romanian, mixed with Latin phrases that carried the weight of ritual and ceremony. words that seemed to make the air itself shimmer with energy that raised goosebumps along Arya's arms. "Tatal meu este regale umbrelor," Luna whispered, her voice taking on harmonics that belonged in Gothic cathedrals rather than sterile hospital rooms. "El va venissimo salveze din această închisoare de carne și durere, de curse care mă leagă la această formă fragilă și muritoare." Arya found herself understanding fragments of meaning, despite having no knowledge of Romanian, as if the words carried their own translation written in emotions that transcended language barriers. Father Kingdom shadows, prison flesh, pain curse, binding fragile mortal form. The medical equipment registered readings that defied human physiology, brain activity that spiked in patterns resembling deep meditation rather than fevered delirium. Heart rhythms that maintained perfect regularity despite core body temperature that should have caused organ failure hours ago. During moments of relative calm, Arya searched Luna's medical records with growing confusion, discovering gaps and inconsistencies that made her question everything she thought she knew about the mysterious child. No birth certificate existed in any database, no social security number, no record of immunizations or previous medical care, no emergency contacts or insurance information, nothing that would normally accompany a patient's admission to a major hospital. The computer files showed that Luna had simply appeared in the emergency room 3 months ago, carried in by a man who claimed to have found her collapsed on a city street before disappearing without providing identification or contact information. More disturbing were the subtle changes Arya noticed when she reviewed the same files multiple times throughout her shift, medical notes that seemed to shift and alter when she was not looking directly at them, lab results that displayed different values each time she accessed them, X-rays that showed anatomical features that flickered between normal human bone structure and something else entirely. During her research breaks, she discovered that someone had been leaving clues throughout the hospital. Ancient symbols drawn in condensation on windows that disappeared within minutes, markings that resembled medieval alchemical notation mixed with geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The symbols appeared most frequently near Luna's room, etched into frost that formed on glass surfaces despite the hospital's climate control system, as if something with supernatural cold was moving through the corridors during the deepest hours of night. Arya began researching folklore and mythology during her few hours of sleep, discovering legends of vampire nobility that ruled hidden kingdoms and blood curses that trapped immortal beings in mortal flesh. Stories that read like fantasy until compared against Luna's impossible medical profile. Meanwhile, Alaric Voss arrived at the hospital disguised as Dr. Alexander Vance, a CDC inspector investigating unusual pathogen cases that had supposedly appeared in 3 other cities over the past month. His credentials were flawless forgeries, backed by supernatural influence that made hospital administrators eager to cooperate with federal authority they could not afford to question or delay. Alaric possessed the classical features of European nobility, combined with eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, an unsettling quality that made medical staff uncomfortable without being able to articulate exactly why his presence felt wrong on levels deeper than conscious thought. He conducted his examination of Luna with clinical detachment that masked centuries of experience, destroying creatures like the cursed child who lay before him on sterile sheets, noting the progression of symptoms that marked the final stages of blood curse infection. His portable equipment included devices that no human scientist had ever developed, instruments capable of detecting supernatural emanations and measuring the decay rate of immortal essence trapped in mortal flesh. The readings confirmed what he had expected to find: a vampire noble's child in the terminal phases of a masterfully constructed curse that would consume her completely within 72 hours unless the Covenant intervened with the only solution their ancient laws permitted. Arya confided in Detective Sarah Martinez during their weekly coffee meeting at the 24-hour diner 3 blocks from the police station, seeking advice about Luna's mysterious background from someone trained to uncover hidden truths about people who preferred to remain invisible to official scrutiny. Sarah had been Arya's friend since college, a sharp-minded investigator whose instincts for finding patterns in seemingly unconnected events had earned her a reputation for solving cases that other detectives abandoned as hopeless dead ends. The missing birth certificate and medical history interested Sarah professionally, representing the kind of administrative mysteries that often concealed more serious crimes involving human trafficking or child abuse networks that operated in shadows between legal jurisdictions. Sarah's investigation began with routine database searches, but quickly expanded into territory that made her question assumptions about the world she thought she understood, revealing a pattern of missing children and unexplained medical cases spanning decades across multiple states and countries. Hospital records showed children appearing without identification, displaying symptoms that baffled medical professionals, receiving treatment for conditions that had no known cause or cure before disappearing from the system as mysteriously as they had entered. The pattern was subtle enough to escape notice, unless someone was specifically looking for connections between seemingly random events. But once Sarah began mapping the incidents, she discovered a network of cases that suggested something far larger and more organized than isolated instances of child abandonment. Missing persons reports filed by desperate parents describe children who vanished without trace from secure locations, often from their own bedrooms during the night, leaving behind no evidence of forced entry or struggle. The descriptions of the missing children shared common features that went beyond statistical coincidence: unusual pallor, advanced intelligence, eyes that seemed older than their apparent age, and minor behavioral quirks that parents attributed to childhood phases until their sons and daughters disappeared forever. Medical facilities across 3 states reported similar cases of unidentified children arriving with conditions that required specialized treatment, staying for weeks or months before their mysterious guardians removed them against medical advice, leaving behind medical bills paid with cash and false information that led nowhere. Dorian realized too late that his efforts to help his daughter had created a dangerous paper trail that connected him to supernatural activities across multiple jurisdictions. A pattern that someone with Sarah's investigative skills might trace back to its source, with consequences that could expose vampire society to human authorities. His careful manipulations of medical records and computer systems had left digital fingerprints that seemed insignificant individually, but formed a clear picture when examined by someone trained to recognize the signs of systematic deception and cover-up. The realization struck him like physical blow as he monitored police communications from his hidden sanctuary, hearing Sarah's voice discussing patterns that led inexorably toward truths that humans were not supposed to discover about creatures who shared their world. Alaric Voss accelerated his timeline upon learning that law enforcement had become involved in investigating supernatural activities, viewing human attention as a contamination risk that required immediate containment before it could spread beyond acceptable limits. He demanded immediate access to Luna for specialized testing that would confirm her supernatural nature, providing documentation that gave him authority to override any medical or legal objections to his examination of the cursed child. Dr. Holloway found himself under pressure from federal agencies he had never heard of, receiving phone calls from officials whose credentials were impossible to verify, but whose authority seemed absolute when backed by legal documents that made resistance futile. The transfer to a secure medical facility would happen within 48 hours, Alaric explained with cold efficiency that brooked no argument or delay, describing specialized equipment and containment protocols necessary for dealing with pathogens that posed existential threats to public health. That night, Arya discovered she was being followed by men in dark suits who maintained professional distances while making no effort to conceal their surveillance, a psychological pressure tactic designed to create fear without providing grounds for legal complaint. Her apartment showed signs of careful search. Personal belongings moved slightly from their original positions in ways that someone less observant might have missed. Electronics potentially compromised, and private spaces violated by intruders who possessed keys and alarm codes that should have been secure. The net was closing around everyone connected to Luna, drawing them toward a confrontation that would determine whether love could triumph over ancient law, or whether the mysteries of vampire nobility would be buried beneath official explanations that satisfied human curiosity while concealing truths too dangerous for mortal minds to comprehend. Arya sought refuge in St. Mercy's Chapel at 3:17 a.m. After another sleepless shift, her mind churning with questions about Luna's impossible medical readings and the growing certainty that forces beyond her understanding were converging around the mysterious child who had become the center of her world. The small interfaith sanctuary occupied a quiet corner of the hospital's first floor, designed to provide comfort to families facing loss and medical staff seeking moments of peace between the endless crises that defined their professional lives. Soft lighting from stained glass windows cast rainbow patterns across simple wooden pews, while the subtle scent of lilies from recent memorial services lingered in air that felt separate from the antiseptic sterility of the medical floors above. She knelt in the front row with her head bowed and hands clasped, not praying exactly, but seeking some kind of clarity about events that seemed to defy rational explanation, when footsteps echoed behind her with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to moving through sacred spaces. The man who approached wore an expensive charcoal suit that fit perfectly across shoulders broad enough to suggest physical power, his dark hair swept back from classical features that might have been carved from marble by Renaissance masters who understood the intersection between beauty and danger. His eyes held depths that seemed to contain centuries of accumulated knowledge and sorrow, while his presence filled the chapel with energy that made the air itself feel charged with electricity that raised goosebumps along her arms and neck. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice carrying accents that belonged to European courts and old-world aristocracy, inflections that suggested education in languages that predated modern nations. "My name is Dorian Blackthorne, and I am the reason you have been drawn into circumstances that will change your understanding of reality itself. I am Luna's father, though explaining that relationship requires revelations that may shatter everything you believe about the world you inhabit." Arya turned to face him with heart hammering against her ribs, recognizing something familiar in his classical features that echoed Luna's bone structure beneath the pallor and fever that had consumed the child's face for months. But recognition brought questions rather than answers, confusion about how this obviously wealthy and powerful man could be the father of an abandoned child with no legal guardians or medical history, mysteries that seemed to deepen rather than resolve with his presence in the sacred space where she had sought clarity. "I am what human folklore calls a vampire," he continued, his words delivered with matter-of-fact precision that made them somehow more terrifying than dramatic declarations might have been. "I have walked this earth for over 800 years, ruling a kingdom of shadows that exists parallel to your mortal world, governing creatures whose existence depends on remaining invisible to human awareness. My daughter Seraphina was cursed 3 years ago by enemies who understood that the cruelest way to destroy me was through her slow death, trapped in mortal flesh that grows weaker with each passing day. The curse that binds her to that hospital bed can only be broken by someone who loves her without knowing her true nature, someone whose heart is pure enough to see past the monster she has been forced to become." He gestured toward the stained glass windows where colored light painted shifting patterns on chapel walls, and Arya watched in stunned silence as his reflection failed to appear in the polished surface of memorial plaques mounted on nearby pillars, absence that confirmed truths her rational mind desperately wanted to reject. "Luna is not dying from any pathogen human medicine can identify," he explained, his voice heavy with grief that seemed to echo through centuries of accumulated loss. She is a vampire child trapped between life and death, sustained only by the innocent life force she unknowingly draws from those who care for her. Each moment of connection extending her existence while slowly consuming the very essence that makes her immortal. The medical equipment registers impossible readings because her physiology operates according to supernatural laws rather than biological principles. Her fever burns away the curse's influence, while her body fights to maintain its connection to immortal essence that grows weaker with each sunset. Arya felt reality reshaping itself around revelations that made her question every assumption she had built about the nature of existence, forcing her to confront the possibility that monsters from childhood nightmares shared the world with ordinary people who remained blissfully unaware of dangers that moved through shadows just beyond the reach of electric light. But looking into Dorian's eyes, she saw pain that transcended species or supernatural classification, the raw anguish of a father watching his child suffer while possessing all the power in the world, except the one thing that could save her. The curse requires someone who can love Seraphina, despite knowing what she truly is, he continued, his words carrying desperate hope mixed with fear of rejection that made him seem suddenly vulnerable despite his obvious supernatural advantages. You have shown her kindness when she had nothing to offer in return, comfort when she was isolated and alone, genuine care that transcends duty or obligation. That love is the key to breaking magic designed to be unbreakable, but accepting that role means accepting transformation that will change your humanity forever. He extended his hand toward her, and she saw Luna's true form reflected in his eyes, like a vision granted by proximity to ancient power. A beautiful vampire child with silver eyes and flowing dark hair, who danced through moonlit gardens in kingdoms that existed beyond mortal perception. The illusion lasted only seconds before dissolving back into memories of the pale, fever-stricken girl who had whispered warnings in archaic languages about watchers in parking lot shadows. But the glimpse was enough to show her what Luna could become if freed from the curse that trapped her in dying flesh. What she had been before enemies discovered the perfect weapon to use against a vampire king who had ruled for centuries without knowing the vulnerability that came with loving someone more than power itself. Their moment of connection shattered when the chapel doors burst open with enough force to rattle stained glass in their frames, admitting a man whose presence brought winter air and the scent of old graveyards into the sacred space. Alaric Voss moved with predatory grace that marked him as something other than human, his pale eyes fixed on Dorian with recognition that carried the weight of ancient authority and absolute judgment. Behind him came two figures in dark suits whose movements synchronized with military precision, blocking escape routes while maintaining positions that suggested extensive training in dealing with supernatural threats. Dr. Blackthorne, Alaric said, his voice carrying formal pronunciation that belonged in medieval courts where life and death decisions were rendered with ceremonial precision. You stand in violation of covenant law by revealing vampire nature to mortal witnesses, compounding previous violations regarding your daughter's curse and the contamination risks her presence creates in human medical facilities. Miss Chen has been under surveillance for 72 hours as a potential threat to vampire secrecy. Her investigation into your daughter's background raising concerns that extend beyond simple curiosity about unusual medical cases. Arya felt the world shift again as she realized the men who had been following her represented something far more dangerous than human law enforcement, that her attempts to help a sick child had drawn attention from beings whose justice operated according to rules she could not comprehend. Alaric continued with cold efficiency that brooked no argument or appeal, explaining that supernatural law now classified her as a security risk, whose knowledge of vampire society made her continued existence problematic for creatures who had survived by remaining hidden from human awareness. The Covenant of Shadows had decreed that both father and daughter must face judgment for violations that threatened the ancient compact between vampire nobility and mortal ignorance. But Arya's involvement had expanded their jurisdiction to include her as an accessory to supernatural crimes she had committed unknowingly through simple acts of compassion and care. "You have 48 hours to surrender yourselves for proper judgment," Alaric announced, his words carrying finality that echoed in the chapel's vaulted ceiling, like pronouncements from supernatural courts, where appeals were not permitted, and mercy was a luxury reserved for those who had not violated the fundamental laws governing immortal society. "Your daughter will receive the mercy of quick death rather than prolonged suffering, while Miss Chen's fate depends on how much cooperation we receive during the remaining time before blood moon rises, and all debts must be settled according to traditions older than human civilization." Dorian stepped protectively in front of Arya with movement that seemed to blur at the edges, his sophisticated demeanor dropping away to reveal predatory instincts honed by centuries of survival in a world where power determined justice and weakness invited destruction. The Vampire King's eyes blazed with fury that made the chapel's electric lighting flicker as supernatural energy disrupted mundane technology, while his voice carried authority that had commanded loyalty from immortal beings across multiple continents. "My daughter will not die to satisfy Covenant paranoia about contamination risks," he declared, words resonating with power that made stained glass windows vibrate in their frames. "Miss Chen has done nothing except show kindness to a suffering child, and I will not allow her to become collateral damage in political games that have nothing to do with justice or protection of vampire society." The confrontation escalated into territory where human understanding failed completely, leaving Arya caught between supernatural forces whose conflict would determine whether love could triumph over ancient law, or whether compassion itself would be judged as weakness, deserving punishment by courts that valued secrecy above mercy, and viewed mortal life as acceptable sacrifice to preserve immortal interests that stretched back through centuries of careful isolation from the world they shared but never acknowledged. Alaric Voss moved with inhuman speed across the chapel's polished floor, his pale eyes fixed on Arya with the focused intensity of a predator who had identified prey that could not be allowed to escape alive or unchanged. The ancient laws governing vampire society were absolute in their cruel simplicity. Mortals who learned too much about immortal existence became security risks that required permanent solutions, their knowledge either contained through supernatural compulsion or eliminated through methods that left no trace for human authorities to investigate. "Miss Chen now falls under Covenant jurisdiction," he announced with ceremonial precision that carried the weight of supernatural law enforcement dating back to medieval courts, where vampire nobility had first established protocols for maintaining secrecy in an increasingly connected world. Her investigation into medical anomalies, her documented interactions with a cursed vampire child, and her presence during unauthorized revelation of immortal nature constitute violations that demand immediate containment before contamination spreads beyond acceptable limits. Dorian stepped between Alaric and Arya, with movement that seemed to blur reality itself, his sophisticated facade dropping away to reveal predatory instincts honed through 8 centuries of survival in courts where political miscalculation meant permanent death. The Vampire King's eyes blazed with fury that made electric lighting flicker throughout the chapel, while power radiated from his form in waves that caused stained glass windows to vibrate with harmonic frequencies that human ears could barely detect. "You will not touch her," he declared, his voice carrying authority that had commanded loyalty from supernatural beings across multiple continents and political upheavals that had reshaped the immortal world dozens of times throughout history. "She has committed no crimes except showing compassion to a suffering child, and I will not allow Covenant paranoia about security breaches to destroy an innocent woman whose only mistake was possessing a heart pure enough to love without expecting anything in return." Alaric's response came with surgical precision that revealed centuries of experience dealing with rebellious vampire nobility who believed their ancient titles provided immunity from supernatural justice, his pale fingers moving toward weapons concealed beneath expensive tailoring, while backup enforcers shifted positions to cut off potential escape routes through chapel doors and windows. The woman has witnessed vampire transformation, heard detailed explanations of immortal society structure, and gained knowledge that makes her continued existence as an uncontrolled mortal impossible under laws established to prevent exposure events that could trigger human military response against our hidden communities. Her fate was sealed the moment you chose personal desires over collective security, and her detention under Covenant authority represents mercy compared to alternatives our predecessors employed when dealing with contaminated witnesses. The confrontation erupted into supernatural violence that shattered the chapel's peaceful atmosphere, like glass breaking under impossible pressure. Dorian moving with speed that left afterimages, while Alaric drew weapons that seemed to absorb light from their surroundings. But rather than engaging in battle that would certainly result in Arya's death regardless of its outcome, Dorian grasped her hand with fingers cold as winter metal and spoke words in ancient Romanian that made reality bend around them like heated glass. The chapel dissolved into shadow and vertigo as vampire magic transported them through space in ways that defied human understanding of physics. Emerging moments later in the hospital parking garage, where Dorian's black sedan waited with engine running and doors unlocked. "Drive," he commanded, pressing keys into her trembling hands, while scanning shadows for signs of pursuit that could materialize from any direction. The Covenant has resources you cannot imagine: surveillance networks that span continents, and communication systems that operate faster than human technology. But we have minutes before they mobilize enough forces to seal off every exit from this city. Arya found herself behind the wheel of a car worth more than her annual salary, following GPS directions that led through back streets and industrial areas, while Dorian made phone calls in languages she did not recognize to allies whose loyalty had been purchased through centuries of careful political maneuvering. Meanwhile, 3 floors above in the intensive care unit, Luna's condition deteriorated with frightening speed as the magical connection that had sustained her through 18 months of Arya's visits began to fade like a candle flame deprived of oxygen. Without regular contact with the pure soul whose love had been slowly breaking the curse's hold over her immortal essence, the blood magic reasserted its dominance with vicious efficiency designed to inflict maximum suffering on its victim and psychological torture on those who cared about her fate. Her already pale skin became translucent enough to reveal dark veins beneath, like rivers of poison flowing through marble, while her temperature climbed to levels that registered as equipment malfunction on digital thermometers never designed to measure supernatural fever. The medical staff watched in horrified fascination as she began aging rapidly through decades of compressed time, her child's face gaining lines and hollow cheeks while her hair turned silver with premature age that spoke of curses too complex for human medicine to understand or treat. Dr. Holloway discovered his computer systems compromised by intrusion, so sophisticated that it left no trace of entry while systematically altering medical records to remove evidence of Luna's impossible physiology and Arya's unauthorized visits. Patient files shifted before his eyes as he watched, lab results changing to show normal human readings, while witness statements from nursing staff were edited to remove references to unusual behavior or unexplained phenomena. The digital manipulation extended beyond simple data modification into reality alteration that made him question his own memories, wondering if the strange readings and impossible vital signs had been hallucinations brought on by overwork and stress, rather than evidence of supernatural activity operating within his hospital. Detective Sarah Martinez made discoveries that filled her with dread as she investigated the pattern of missing children and unexplained medical cases, finding bodies of previous hospital staff who had gotten too close to secrets that powerful forces wanted to remain buried. The deaths had been attributed to accidents, suicides, and random crimes that left no apparent connection between victims whose only common factor was employment at medical facilities that had treated unusual pediatric cases. Autopsy reports showed cause of death consistent with their official explanations, but Sarah's trained eye noticed details that suggested professional elimination disguised as mundane tragedy, positioning of bodies and wound patterns that spoke of expertise in making murder look like misfortune. The hospital entered lockdown protocols as federal authorities arrived with credentials that could not be questioned and equipment that seemed designed for containing biological threats rather than investigating medical irregularities. Luna found herself trapped in the intensive care unit as armed personnel sealed off access routes, their presence explained as necessary precautions for dealing with unknown pathogens that posed potential risks to public health if allowed to spread beyond controlled medical environments. Beneath the old cathedral that had stood at the heart of the city for over 2 centuries, Dorian led Arya through hidden passages carved from living rock by vampire architects who understood the necessity of sanctuary spaces where immortal nobility could retreat when human politics threatened their existence. The sanctuary had been constructed during the Civil War era, when supernatural society had split along lines that paralleled mortal conflict, providing neutral ground where opposing factions could meet without triggering blood feuds that might expose vampire involvement in human affairs to authorities already suspicious of foreign influences operating within American borders. Electric lighting had been added during the 1920s renovation, but the chamber retained its medieval atmosphere with stone arches that supported weight distributed across centuries of careful engineering and tapestries that depicted vampire history in symbolic imagery, comprehensible only to those educated in immortal tradition. Arya found herself in a library that contained books written in languages that predated modern nations, volumes bound in leather that might not have come from mundane animals, and filled with knowledge that could drive unprepared minds to madness if absorbed too quickly without proper preparation and understanding. "This is the reality you have entered by loving my daughter," Dorian explained as he poured wine that tasted of copper and starlight into crystal glasses that caught candlelight like captured moonbeams. Vampire society operates according to hierarchies established through centuries of political evolution, with noble houses maintaining power through carefully balanced alliances and territorial agreements that prevent the kind of open warfare that nearly exposed our existence during the medieval period, when human populations were smaller and supernatural activity was easier to conceal. The Covenant of Shadows serves as our governing council, enforcing laws designed to protect immortal society from discovery by mortal authorities who possess increasingly sophisticated technology for detecting anomalies that our ancestors could hide through simple manipulation of primitive communication networks. The curse-binding Seraphina represents the pinnacle of blood magic developed by vampire clans who specialized in weapons designed to destroy their own kind, spells so complex and vicious that they violate treaties governing supernatural warfare, but remain technically legal under ancient precedents that predate modern civilization. The magical binding can only be broken by someone who chooses to love her despite knowing her true nature. But the ritual required to complete that love involves sharing life force in ways that will transform your mortality into something between human and vampire, granting extended lifespan and supernatural abilities while maintaining enough humanity to serve as anchor point for her immortal essence. Above ground, the Covenant initiated disinformation campaigns designed to discredit Arya's reputation and justify her detention under laws that human authorities would never be allowed to examine or question. Her photograph appeared on wanted posters, identifying her as a dangerous cult leader who had been conducting illegal medical experiments on terminally ill children, accusations supported by evidence so carefully fabricated that it would withstand scrutiny from investigators who lacked supernatural knowledge to recognize the signs of vampire political manipulation. Detective Martinez found herself under pressure from federal agencies she had never heard of to arrest her former friend on charges that seemed to multiply every hour, each new accusation supported by documentation that made resistance appear futile, and questions about evidence sources seem like obstruction of national security investigations. Dr. Holloway contacted Arya through encrypted channels he had established during his own investigation into supernatural medical mysteries that had plagued hospitals across multiple states for decades, revealing that his research had uncovered other cases where medical staff had disappeared or died after treating patients whose conditions defied scientific explanation. His message carried desperate urgency, mixed with professional curiosity about phenomena that challenged everything he had learned during 30 years of medical practice, offering to help despite understanding that his assistance might cost him career and potentially life if discovered by forces that had demonstrated willingness to eliminate witnesses to preserve their secrets. But his communication was intercepted by Covenant surveillance networks that monitored digital traffic for keywords and behavioral patterns associated with supernatural security breaches, allowing Alaric Voss to trace the transmission back to its source within minutes of its transmission. The enforcer arrived at Dr. Holloway's office with resources that made resistance impossible, using combination of supernatural compulsion and physical intimidation to transform the doctor into unwilling bait for a trap designed to capture both Dorian and Arya when they attempted to rescue Luna from her deteriorating condition. Meanwhile, Luna's curse accelerated beyond all previous parameters as her connection to Arya weakened through distance and time, her small body aging through decades of compressed existence while monitors registered vital signs that fluctuated between impossible extremes. Dorian realized that conventional rescue attempts would fail against Covenant security measures designed to contain vampire nobility, with access to resources that spanned continents and centuries of accumulated power, forcing him to consider options that violated his personal principles and political position within immortal society. Contact with the Shadowmere clan, his ancient enemies who had cursed Seraphina, offered the only possibility of temporary safe passage through territory they controlled around the hospital. But their price demanded everything he had built through 8 centuries of careful political maneuvering and strategic alliance formation. They would grant 6 hours of neutrality in exchange for his formal abdication as vampire king and acceptance of eternal servitude to their house, terms that would cost him crown, freedom, and authority, while providing no guarantee that Seraphina could be saved even if they reached her before the curse completed its deadly work. Arya watched him struggle with the decision that would determine not only his daughter's fate, but the future of vampire political structure in the Western Hemisphere. Realizing that her simple desire to comfort a sick child had triggered consequences that reached far beyond anything she could have imagined when she first entered room 237 with pockets full of contraband cookies and handmade cards. The price of love, she understood now, extended far beyond personal sacrifice to encompass entire worlds that operated according to rules more ancient and unforgiving than human justice could comprehend. Dorian studied blueprints of St. Mercy Children's Hospital spread across the stone table in his underground sanctuary, architectural drawings that revealed service corridors and utility tunnels invisible to ordinary visitors who moved through public spaces without understanding the complex infrastructure that supported modern medical facilities. 24 hours remained until the blood moon deadline that would seal Seraphina's fate forever, forcing him to balance supernatural abilities against Covenant security measures that had transformed the hospital into a fortress designed specifically to contain vampire infiltration attempts. Arya traced maintenance routes with her finger, while explaining shift changes and security rotations, memorized through 18 months of unauthorized visits, her knowledge of human protocols complementing his centuries of experience with supernatural warfare in ways that might create opportunities where brute force would certainly fail. The Covenant has replaced hospital security with their own personnel, she explained, noting camera positions that had been upgraded since Alaric's arrival 3 days earlier. But they don't understand the building's quirks, the broken locks and faulty sensors that regular staff work around every day, the blind spots created by equipment placement that wasn't designed with vampire infiltration in mind. Dorian's enhanced senses detected Covenant patrols throughout the city as immortal enforcers established perimeters around potential escape routes, their supernatural coordination creating surveillance networks that human law enforcement could never achieve through conventional communication methods. The enemy possessed advantages that included centuries of tactical experience and weapons designed specifically to neutralize vampire abilities. But they also carried weaknesses rooted in arrogance about their own superiority and assumptions about mortal capabilities that Arya's presence might help exploit. Detective Sarah Martinez had spent 72 hours following investigative leads that revealed conspiracy extending far beyond missing children and unexplained medical cases, uncovering evidence of systematic cover-ups that involved federal agencies she had never heard of, and witness disappearances that followed patterns suggesting professional elimination rather than random violence. Her police training recognized signs of organized criminal activity, operating with resources and coordination that exceeded anything in her experience. While her personal loyalty to Arya demanded action, despite career risks that could destroy everything she had built through 15 years of dedicated service to law enforcement ideals that seemed increasingly naive when confronted with evidence of supernatural warfare conducted in shadows between human awareness and official acknowledgement. She coordinated her assistance through encrypted channels that Dorian's technological resources had established, agreeing to create diversions that would draw Covenant attention away from the intensive care unit during the narrow window when rescue remained theoretically possible. The plan required precise timing that left no margin for error. With Sarah staging domestic disturbance calls and false alarms throughout the hospital district, while Arya and Dorian approached their target through routes that avoided main surveillance corridors where vampire enforcers maintained constant vigilance. At 11:30 p.m., they entered through the hospital's loading dock, using Dorian's supernatural influence over electronic locks and security systems, moving through service tunnels that connected different wings while avoiding areas where Covenant patrols concentrated their attention. Arya's keycard access remained functional despite her fugitive status, suggesting either administrative oversight or deliberate trap designed to lure them into controlled environment where capture would be inevitable regardless of their tactical advantages. They reached the intensive care unit through routes that required Dorian to manipulate surveillance footage in real time, his centuries of experience with technological evolution, allowing him to edit digital records while they moved through spaces that should have been impossible to penetrate without triggering alarms that would bring immediate response from supernatural enforcement teams. But when they finally reached room 237, they discovered emptiness that struck like physical blow, medical equipment disconnected and bed linen stripped away as if the mysterious child had never existed within sterile walls that now seemed to mock their desperate infiltration efforts. Security footage showed Alaric Voss removing Luna 4 hours earlier under authority of emergency medical transport orders that gave him unlimited jurisdiction over the cursed vampire child whose condition had been classified as immediate threat to public health requiring specialized containment protocols. The trail led through digital records that had been carefully scrubbed to eliminate evidence of destination or timing, forcing Dorian to employ supernatural contacts throughout the medical community who possessed information that human databases could not provide about facilities equipped to handle patients whose very existence violated natural law. Tracking signals intercepted from Covenant communications led them to an abandoned research facility 40 miles outside the city. A complex of buildings that had been constructed during the Cold War era for medical experiments that government agencies preferred to conduct away from populated areas where oversight might interfere with projects deemed necessary for national security. The facility had been officially decommissioned 20 years earlier, but satellite imagery revealed recent activity, including vehicle traffic and power consumption, that suggested current operations hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic misdirection and classified documentation that kept curious investigators away from secrets too dangerous for civilian oversight. Dorian approached the complex with predatory caution, honed through centuries of survival, in environments where a single mistake meant permanent death. His enhanced senses detecting supernatural signatures that confirmed Alaric's presence, along with weapons that radiated malevolent energy designed to destroy immortal essence itself. The Crimson Blade had been forged in medieval vampire courts by craftsmen who understood the intersection between metallurgy and magic, blessed with rituals so dark that their very performance had been forbidden by treaties governing supernatural warfare, until political necessity forced the Covenant to authorize tools capable of eliminating infected vampires whose continued existence threatened immortal society as a whole. Arya felt terror unlike anything in her human experience as they entered buildings where fluorescent lights flickered with unnatural frequencies that hurt her eyes, while air conditioning systems circulated atmosphere thick with ozone and copper that tasted like blood mixed with electricity. Deep within the complex, they found Luna strapped to a medical examination table surrounded by equipment that seemed designed for dissection rather than healing, her small body convulsing with seizures as the curse accelerated through its final phases, with help from drugs that enhanced supernatural vulnerability while suppressing her natural vampire resistance to magical binding. Alaric stood over her with clinical detachment that masked centuries of experience destroying creatures like the dying child before him, the crimson blade gleaming in his pale hand with light that seemed to absorb shadows from surrounding darkness, while radiating cold that made nearby metal surfaces frost over, despite the facility's climate control systems. "Your arrival saves me the trouble of hunting you across multiple jurisdictions," he announced with formal precision that carried the weight of supernatural law enforcement dating back to courts where vampire nobility had first established protocols for maintaining secrecy among increasingly suspicious human populations. "The child's suffering ends tonight, followed by your own elimination as security threats, whose continued existence violates every principle that has allowed our kind to survive in a world where discovery means extinction." Dorian moved with speed that left afterimages while drawing weapons of his own, ancient blades forged by craftsmen whose names had been forgotten by all but the most learned scholars of immortal history, steel that sang with harmonics designed to channel vampire nobility's supernatural heritage through metallurgical techniques that predated human understanding of physics and chemistry. The battle that followed exceeded human comprehension as two immortal beings fought with abilities that violated natural law, their supernatural strength shattering concrete walls, while movement that approached teleportation left scorch marks on surfaces never designed to contain forces that operated according to principles older than human civilization itself. Each wound inflicted by the Crimson Blade weakened Dorian permanently, the cursed weapon designed to sever not just flesh, but the magical essence that sustained vampire immortality, making every cut a step toward final death that no amount of supernatural healing could reverse or delay. But Arya realized with crystalline clarity that the bonding ritual described in ancient texts did not require Dorian's active participation, only her willingness to sacrifice mortal existence for love that transcended species boundaries and supernatural classification systems that divided the world into categories of human and monster. She began speaking words in archaic Romanian that seemed to rise from some deep knowledge she had never possessed, syllables that carried power accumulated through centuries of vampire tradition, while her life force began flowing toward the dying child whose curse had been designed to resist every conventional method of magical intervention. Alaric turned the crimson blade toward her, with movements precise as surgical instruments, understanding that her transformation would complete the ritual regardless of whether she survived its completion, making her elimination the priority that superseded even Dorian's destruction, in terms of preventing outcomes that violated Covenant authority over immortal society's future development. Arya poured her life essence into Luna through words that seemed to write themselves across reality in letters of fire and starlight. Feeling mortality drain away like water flowing through broken vessels, while power older than human memory filled spaces left empty by her willing sacrifice of everything that had defined her existence until this moment of absolute commitment to love that demanded everything and offered no guarantees, except the certainty that some things mattered more than personal survival or comfort or safety. The blood moon reached its zenith as astronomical forces aligned in configurations that occurred perhaps once per century. Lunar light filtered through atmosphere thick with supernatural energy that made the abandoned facility feel like sacred ground, where ancient rituals had been performed by beings whose names were remembered only in legends that most humans dismissed as primitive superstition about monsters that had never existed outside imagination and folklore. The curse binding Seraphina began dissolving under pressure from love so pure and selfless that it overwhelmed magical defenses designed by vampire sorcerers who had never encountered emotion untainted by self-interest or personal agenda, the dark enchantment unraveling like cloth subjected to forces it had never been designed to resist. Luna's child form flickered like candlelight in wind, revealing glimpses of her true nature as vampire princess, whose beauty had inspired poets in courts where immortal nobility had ruled territories that spanned continents before modern nations redrew maps according to purely human political considerations. Silver eyes opened with awareness that belonged to someone far older than her apparent age, while dark hair spread across the medical table like spilled ink that caught moonlight streaming through windows, positioned to provide optimal viewing of celestial events. But Arya's transformation came with costs that rewrote the fundamental nature of her existence. Mortality giving way to hybrid state that granted extended lifespan and supernatural abilities while maintaining enough humanity to serve as bridge between species that had evolved along separate paths for millennia. She felt her heartbeat slow to rhythms that matched lunar cycles rather than solar days, while her vision expanded to encompass wavelengths of light invisible to ordinary human perception, revealing world layered with magical energies that she had never suspected existed alongside the mundane reality where she had spent 32 years believing that electric lights and medical equipment represented the summit of human achievement. Dorian's battle with Alaric reached crescendo as the Crimson Blade found vital points that no amount of vampire regeneration could heal. Ancient magic severing connections between immortal essence and physical form in ways that mimicked natural death while preventing the resurrection abilities that normally allowed vampire nobility to recover from wounds that would destroy lesser supernatural beings. But he fought with desperate fury that drew strength from love rather than personal survival instincts, paternal devotion translating into combat effectiveness that surprised even Alaric with its intensity and tactical sophistication. In the moment when the Enforcer's blade pierced his heart with finality that no supernatural healing could reverse, Dorian spoke words that transferred his accumulated authority as Vampire King to Seraphina, making her the youngest ruler in immortal history while establishing Arya as regent and guardian, whose hybrid nature qualified her to serve as advisor in matters requiring understanding of both human and vampire perspectives. The ancient ritual of succession operated according to blood bonds that transcended death itself. Royal authority flowing from dying father to transformed daughter, through magical inheritance that had sustained vampire civilization through centuries of political upheaval and supernatural warfare that had reshaped immortal society dozens of times throughout recorded history. Alaric fell beneath wounds that his own cursed blade had made unhealable, the weapon's power turning against him when Dorian's final strike channeled royal magic through steel that had been blessed by vampire nobility, whose names were carved in monuments that predated written language. The abandoned facility fell silent, except for electronic humming from equipment that had recorded supernatural events beyond its programming parameters, while moonlight illuminated three figures whose transformation during a single night had altered the political structure governing creatures whose existence remained hidden from human awareness through careful maintenance of boundaries between mundane reality and supernatural truth that operated according to laws older than human civilization itself. 6 months after the blood moon that had changed everything, St. Mercy Children's Hospital gleamed with renovations funded by an anonymous benefactor whose generosity had transformed the pediatric wing into something that resembled a palace more than a medical facility, with murals depicting enchanted forests where unicorns grazed beside crystal streams and dragons soared through skies, painted in colors that seemed to shift depending on the angle of observation. Arya Chen moved through corridors lined with marble, imported from quarries in Tuscany, her steps silent on floors inlaid with patterns that incorporated ancient symbols of healing and protection, designs that most observers dismissed as artistic flourishes, but which served practical purposes for those who understood the intersection between beauty and supernatural necessity. Her appearance had changed subtly over the months since the bonding ritual that had saved Serafina's life, her dark hair now bearing streaks of silver that caught light like threads of starlight woven through midnight silk, while her eyes held depths that seemed to reflect knowledge acquired through experiences that stretched beyond normal human comprehension. The children she visited noticed the changes without understanding their significance, commenting on how her touch seemed to ease pain more effectively than morphine, and how her presence brought comfort that transcended anything medical science could explain or replicate through pharmaceutical intervention. Room 314 had become her favorite stop during evening rounds, housing a 7-year-old boy named Marcus, whose leukemia had resisted every conventional treatment until Arya began incorporating healing abilities she was still learning to control, channeling life force in ways that strengthened his immune system, while carefully avoiding the kind of dramatic recovery that might attract unwanted medical attention. She sat beside his bed reading from a collection of fairy tales that had been written specifically for children facing terminal diagnoses, stories where brave young heroes overcame impossible odds through courage and determination rather than magic. Though she suspected that the subtle supernatural influence she wove into her voice carried healing properties that operated beyond conscious detection. Marcus listened with eyes that seemed too old for his small face, occasionally asking questions about the characters that revealed intelligence sharpened by proximity to mortality, while monitors displayed vital signs that showed steady improvement, medical staff attributed to experimental treatments rather than supernatural intervention. Down the hall in the common area, Serafina helped distribute gifts to children whose families could not afford toys or books, her appearance carefully maintained to suggest a healthy 12-year-old volunteer rather than a vampire princess learning to rule a fractured kingdom from shadows that existed parallel to the mortal world. She had mastered the art of appearing completely human while retaining access to immortal abilities that allowed her to sense which children needed comfort most desperately, moving between hospital beds with intuition that guided her toward those who would benefit from supernatural healing disguised as simple kindness and attention. Her transformation from the dying child known as Luna had required months of careful recovery as her immortal essence rebuilt itself within flesh, no longer constrained by the blood curse that had trapped her between life and death. But the experience had changed her in ways that extended beyond physical healing into emotional understanding of mortal fragility that most vampire nobility never developed through centuries of immortal existence. The political situation within vampire society remained complex and dangerous, with various noble houses questioning whether someone who had experienced mortality could possess the ruthless judgment necessary to rule immortal beings whose survival depended on maintaining absolute secrecy from human authorities, increasingly capable of detecting supernatural activity through technological advancement. Detective Sarah Martinez had become their primary ally in managing incidents that threatened to expose vampire activity to law enforcement agencies unprepared to handle supernatural crime. Using her position within the police department to redirect investigations away from evidence that might lead human authorities toward truths they lacked the institutional framework to process or contain. She maintained careful files documenting patterns of unusual activity while ensuring that official reports contained explanations that satisfied supervisors without raising questions about phenomena that defied conventional understanding. Walking a careful line between professional integrity and protection of secrets that could destabilize society if revealed to populations unprepared for the reality of sharing their world with immortal predators. Her partnership with Arya and Serafina operated through encrypted communications and clandestine meetings in locations chosen for their isolation from both supernatural surveillance and human law enforcement monitoring, creating a network of mutual support that bridged the gap between mortal institutions and vampire politics in ways that benefited both communities, while maintaining the delicate balance that prevented open conflict between species that possessed the potential to destroy each other through warfare that would leave civilization in ruins. The hospital wing where Arya conducted her evening rounds had been designed according to specifications that incorporated both cutting-edge medical technology and subtle supernatural protections, creating an environment where human healing could be enhanced through immortal intervention without triggering the kind of miraculous recoveries that might attract scientific investigation capable of detecting non-human influences. Treatment protocols developed through collaboration between human medical expertise and vampire knowledge of physiological manipulation had resulted in survival rates for terminal pediatric cases that earned national recognition while remaining within statistical ranges that could be attributed to improved funding and experimental procedures rather than supernatural assistance that operated beyond the boundaries of accepted medical science. The success stories walked through those halls every day. Children who had been given months to live, but who now played games and attended classes in educational facilities that rivaled private academies attended by the children of billionaires. Their recovery documented in medical journals that attributed their survival to breakthrough treatments funded by anonymous donors whose generosity had revolutionized pediatric care, without revealing the true source of innovations that combined human scientific method with immortal understanding of life force manipulation. But tonight, as Arya finished her rounds and prepared to join Serafina for their weekly review of hospital operations and Vampire Kingdom administration, she noticed shadows moving beyond the windows in patterns that suggested surveillance by entities whose presence carried menace that made her hybrid senses react with warning signals that prickled along her spine like electricity seeking ground. Through glass that reflected interior lighting back into the renovated corridors, she caught sight of figures positioned on rooftops across from the hospital, their silhouettes suggesting armor and weapons that belonged to no human military or law enforcement agency, while their movement patterns indicated coordination that spoke of training in supernatural warfare techniques developed for conflicts between immortal beings whose battles could reshape political structures that had remained stable for centuries. Serafina appeared beside her with the silent grace that marked her vampire heritage, her young face reflecting concern that went beyond simple worry into territory that suggested recognition of threats that carried the potential to destroy everything they had built together through sacrifice and determination that had already cost more than either of them had expected to pay. The European vampire courts have sent representatives to challenge my right to rule, she explained in a voice that carried authority developed through months of intensive education in immortal politics and supernatural law, while maintaining the careful modulation necessary to avoid attracting attention from human medical staff who moved through the corridors around them. They question whether someone who has experienced mortality can possess the judgment necessary to govern immortal beings, and they have brought weapons that make the Crimson Blade look like a ceremonial decoration, rather than a functional instrument of supernatural enforcement. The artifacts they carry were forged during the medieval period when vampire society nearly tore itself apart through civil wars that threatened to expose our existence to human authorities who possessed neither the understanding nor the resources to coexist peacefully with creatures whose survival requirements included regular consumption of human life force. Arya felt the weight of approaching conflicts settling around them, like storm clouds gathering on horizons that promised devastation for anyone caught in the path of supernatural warfare between political factions whose disputes had been simmering for decades, while waiting for the right moment to explode into open violence. Their quiet moment of reading to sick children and distributing gifts represented more than simple charity work, serving as proof that love could triumph over ancient curses while creating something beautiful from circumstances that had begun with desperate measures taken by beings whose understanding of mortality had been shaped by centuries of viewing human life as temporary and disposable. The hospital wing filled with the voices of children laughing at stories read by volunteers who possessed abilities that transcended normal human limitations, while in the shadows beyond their sanctuary, representatives of vampire nobility prepared to test whether compassion could survive political pressures designed to crush anything that threatened traditional power structures built on fear and isolation. The final image that would remain in memory showed Arya moving through corridors lined with artistic masterpieces and cutting-edge medical equipment, her cart filled with gifts chosen specifically for each child she visited. But now she was accompanied by someone whose presence transformed simple acts of kindness into revolutionary statements about the possibility of bridging gaps between species that had existed in mutual ignorance for millennia. Those watching from the shadows included allies as well as enemies, creating a complex web of supernatural politics where every gesture carried potential consequences that could reshape immortal society while determining whether the next generation of sick children would receive healing that combined the best aspects of human medical science with vampire understanding of life force manipulation, or whether ancient prejudices would triumph over innovation and condemn both species to continued isolation that served no purpose except preserving traditions that had outlived their usefulness in a world where cooperation offered benefits that neither group could achieve through independent action.